He had one storm's worth of time to shore up the old levee before the river took the farm. Roan Castellan had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a levee maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any earthwork he passed for signs of weakness, a habit that had led him more than once that year to exactly the kind of forgotten infrastructure that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 7 months earlier, when the regional flood control district that employed him privatized its levee maintenance division, eliminating his entire crew in a single round of contract changes. He had been moving through river valleys ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The privatization decision had come with barely 2 weeks' notice, and Roan had spent the 7 months since relearning, valley by valley, that his particular skill with earthwork assessment and flood control mattered a great deal less to most temporary employers than whether he had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. He had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure, his own father having maintained levee systems for nearly 3 decades before him, and he had learned, riding along on inspection walks as a boy, the particular gravity of a levee's true purpose, that behind every mile of earthen wall sat entire communities trusting that wall to hold when the river eventually tested it. He arrived at a modest farm outside Elderberry Bend on a darkening afternoon in early autumn, storm clouds already building over the river valley with the particular heaviness that promised considerably more rain than the ground could easily absorb. The air itself carried the specific electric tension of a serious storm, still hours away but already announcing its approach, and Roan quickened his own pace instinctively, understanding from years around exactly this kind of weather how little warning sometimes separated the first heavy clouds from the storm's actual arrival. An elderly woman stood at the edge of her property, staring at a visible sag in the earthen levee separating her farm from the rising river, her expression carrying the specific dread of someone who understood exactly what that sag meant. "That levee's been weakening for years," she said, noticing Roan's approach without turning from her study of the earthwork. "I've reported it to the county 3 times, always told there's no budget for inspection, let alone repair. Storm coming tonight is supposed to be the worst this valley's seen in a decade. I don't think that levee survives it as it stands." She said all of this without once looking away from the sag, as though watching it closely enough might somehow slow whatever damage the coming night intended to do. "How bad is the weak section?" Roan asked. "Bad enough that I can see daylight through a section of it if I get close enough," the woman said. "Name's Corinne Ashby. This farm's been in my family for 3 generations. I don't have anywhere else to go if the river takes it tonight, and I don't have the money to hire an emergency crew even if one could reach us before the storm actually arrives." "How much time before the storm hits?" Roan asked, studying the darkening sky himself, gauging the clouds' movement with the particular practiced eye of someone who had spent years learning to read weather as closely as any instrument could measure it. "Weather Service says the worst of it arrives around midnight," Corinne said. "Maybe 6 hours from now, though I don't trust their timing entirely given how fast these clouds are already moving." "I used to do exactly this kind of levee maintenance," Roan said. "I'd want to see the weak section directly before I could tell you honestly whether 6 hours gives us any real chance of shoring it up properly." He set his duffel bag down at the property's edge, already rolling up his sleeves in anticipation of whatever the assessment revealed. Corinne led him to the sag, and Roan's own trained eye confirmed her fear almost immediately. A section of the levee's earthen core had eroded from years of untreated seepage, leaving a weakened point that, under the pressure of a genuinely significant flood surge, could fail catastrophically, rather than simply overtopping gradually the way a healthier levee might. He knelt at the weakest point, running his hand along the visible gap Corinne had described, understanding immediately that the erosion had been progressing for years rather than months. The particular slow damage of water finding the same weakness repeatedly until it finally became visible to the naked eye. "This has been failing gradually for a long time," Roan said. "Years, probably, judging by the extent of the erosion. Whatever seepage started this weakness never got properly addressed, and it's simply worn deeper with every wet season since. This needs proper reinforcement, not just patching," Roan said. "I'll need sandbags, whatever heavy material you have on the property that could add mass and stability to this section, and every spare hand willing to help before that storm actually arrives." "I don't have sandbags," Corinne admitted. "I don't have the money for that kind of supply, and the county's emergency stockpile is reserved for the town itself, not individual farms." "Then we improvise," Roan said. "Do you have any empty feed sacks, tarps, anything we could fill with soil or gravel to build mass against that weak section?" Corinne's face brightened slightly. "I've got dozens of empty feed sacks in the barn, and there's a gravel pile left over from when we resurfaced the driveway last spring. That's exactly what we need," Roan said. "Let's start moving." They spent the following hour hauling sacks and gravel from the barn and driveway to the weakened section, Roan working alongside Corinne despite her own age, both of them racing against a sky that grew visibly darker with each passing quarter hour. "I should have pushed the county harder," Corinne admitted, catching her breath during a brief pause. "I reported this 3 times and let each rejection convince me I'd done what I could. I don't think that was actually true." "You did what most people do when an institution keeps telling them no," Roan said. "I don't think that's a failure on your part. Whatever the county's own negligence eventually cost you tonight." Word of the effort reached Corinne's neighbors within the hour, and several arrived to help without being asked, understanding exactly what a levee failure would mean, not just for Corinne's farm, but for the low-lying properties downstream that depended on the same earthwork holding through the coming storm. "This levee's protected 6 farms along this stretch of river for as long as anyone can remember," a rancher named Otis Pruitt told Roan, arriving with his own truck loaded with additional feed sacks from his own barn. "I don't much care whose levee it's technically registered as. If it fails tonight, we all lose considerably more than just Corinne's crop." Others arrived in similar fashion through that first hour, a young father bringing his own truck's worth of gravel, 2 teenage sons willing to haul sacks despite the gathering storm, an older woman who'd once worked construction before retirement, offering her own practical knowledge of exactly how earthwork reinforcement needed to be properly compacted. By the time full darkness settled over the valley, what had begun as Roan and Corinne working alone had become nearly a dozen people working in coordinated shifts against the weakened section. Roan organized the growing crew methodically, understanding that unstructured effort under this kind of time pressure would waste hours neither the storm nor the weakening levee would grant back. He assigned some workers to filling sacks with soil and gravel, others to hauling the filled sacks to the weak section, and personally oversaw the placement itself, understanding that improperly stacked reinforcement could fail even more dangerously than the original weakness if the work wasn't done with genuine structural understanding. "You're building this the way a proper engineer would," Otis observed, watching Roan carefully angle each layer of sacks to distribute pressure evenly against the weakened core. "Most people would just stack these things straight up and hope for the best." "Hoping for the best doesn't hold back a flood surge," Roan said. "This needs to actually function as reinforcement, not just look like effort from a distance." He demonstrated the proper angle for Otis and the others working nearby, explaining the physics of pressure distribution in terms simple enough for anyone to understand and replicate, understanding that the crew's collective effectiveness depended on everyone grasping why the technique mattered rather than simply following instructions blindly. "My father worked construction his whole career," Otis said, adjusting his own sack placement to match Roan's demonstration. I never thought I'd be putting any of what I half remember watching him do to actual use, saving a levee in the middle of a storm. Most people don't expect to use half of what they know until the night they actually need it, Rowan said. By the third hour, with the sky darkening further and the first scattered raindrops beginning to fall, the crew had built a substantial reinforced barrier against the weakened section, sacks stacked in careful overlapping rows that Rowan tested repeatedly for stability as the work progressed. "How's it looking?" Corinne asked, her voice tight with an anxiety that had only grown as the storm's approach became increasingly visible in the darkening sky. "Better than I expected, given what we started with," Rowan said honestly. "I won't promise this holds against everything that storm might bring, but I think we've given this levee a considerably better chance than it had 6 hours ago." The rain arrived in full force around 10 that evening, well ahead of the Weather Service's midnight prediction, and the crew worked through the deteriorating conditions to complete the final sections of reinforcement, soaked through and exhausted but unwilling to stop, while any daylight-sized gap remained unaddressed. Lightning illuminated the valley in brief, stark flashes, revealing the river's surface already churning with a violence that made everyone's urgency considerably more visceral than it had been in the storm's earlier, gentler approach. By 11, with the storm's full fury finally arriving and the river visibly rising against the levee's now reinforced section, Rowan called the work complete, understanding that continuing to add reinforcement in near total darkness risked more harm than benefit at this point. "It's done," he told the assembled crew, all of them soaked and exhausted but standing together watching the river test their work. "Whatever happens now, we've given this levee everything 6 hours could actually provide." A few of the crew members simply nodded, too exhausted for further words, while others gathered closer together beneath what little shelter a nearby tree offered, all of them united in the same anxious vigil. The storm's peak arrived just after midnight, the river surging against the levee with a force that made Corinne visibly flinch each time a particularly large wave crashed against the reinforced section. Rowan stood beside her through the worst of it, monitoring the reinforcement's performance as closely as the darkness and driving rain allowed, ready to warn everyone back from the levee immediately if the barrier showed any sign of the catastrophic failure it had originally faced without their intervention. Otis stood on Rowan's other side, his own flashlight sweeping repeatedly across the reinforced section, calling out observations whenever the beam caught something worth noting. "Holding steady on this end," he shouted over the storm's roar, more than once, each report easing the tension in Corinne's shoulders by some small, incremental measure. The reinforced section held. Water occasionally splashed over the barrier's top in the storm's worst gusts, but the structural failure that had seemed nearly inevitable 6 hours earlier never materialized. The improvised sandbag wall doing exactly what proper reinforcement was meant to do, even under genuinely severe testing. By dawn, with the storm finally passing and the river beginning its slow recession back toward normal levels, the levee stood intact, exhausted but victorious, having held through a test that would very likely have destroyed it in its original weakened condition. The crew stood together at the levee's crest as the first gray light broke over the valley, nobody quite ready to leave until they'd seen for themselves, in proper daylight, exactly what their single night's work had actually accomplished. "You saved this farm," Corinne told Rowan, once the immediate danger had clearly passed. "You saved 6 farms along this stretch of river, working through a single night with nothing but feed sacks and gravel and neighbors willing to show up when it actually mattered." Word of the levee's narrow survival and the community effort that achieved it reached the county within days, and the flood control district, once informed of exactly how close 6 farms had come to catastrophic flooding over infrastructure, the county itself had repeatedly declined to properly inspect or maintain, agreed to fund a full engineering assessment and permanent repair of the weakened section. ensuring the levee would never again depend on a single desperate night's improvised effort to survive a serious storm. The district's own regional supervisor visited Corinne's farm personally the following week, reviewing the improvised reinforcement alongside the community's account of that night, and left visibly troubled by exactly how narrow the margin had actually been. 3 reports over as many years, and no inspection ever conducted, the supervisor said, examining the sandbag wall with evident discomfort at his own agency's failure. I don't think this district can claim it didn't know this section was vulnerable. We simply chose not to prioritize it, and very nearly cost 6 families everything because of that choice. He spent nearly an hour walking the property afterward, taking detailed notes for what he described as a full review of every other reported weakness the district had similarly deferred over recent years. Roan stayed on in Elderberry Bend through that winter and the ones that followed, formally hired by a newly organized levee maintenance cooperative the neighboring farms established, once they understood how narrowly they'd avoided disaster, a position that gave him steady work and the particular satisfaction of protecting, properly and continuously, infrastructure he'd first encountered with only 6 hours left before a storm's arrival. He spent that first year working alongside the professional engineering crew brought in to properly rebuild the weakened section, learning considerably more about the levee's full length and condition than the single night's emergency repair had ever allowed him to properly assess. My grandfather helped build that original levee back when this whole valley first organized its flood protection. Corinne told Roan some months later, watching the properly engineered permanent repair take shape under a professional construction crew's careful work. He always said protecting a river valley was never really one family's job alone, whatever the county's own paperwork said about who technically owned which section. I think this whole valley proved that particular philosophy correct, the one night it actually mattered most, Rowan said. I don't think I've ever seen a dozen strangers organize themselves around a single shared purpose quite that quickly. Rowan wrote to his own father that winter, describing the levee and the 6-hour deadline and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine infrastructure check to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the privatization ended his own maintenance career. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief but proud in the particular way Roan remembered him always being. Told you a good levee man's eye for weakness would find use somewhere, whatever the district decided about needing it anymore. Proud of you for organizing that crew properly under pressure, when 6 farms' worth of livelihoods depended on getting it right before that storm arrived. Roan read the letter twice before folding it carefully away, understanding that his father's particular kind of pride was rarely offered lightly, and mattered to him considerably more for that reason. Roan thought, some evenings that winter, about the 7 months of towns and privatization notices that had led him to a sagging levee on a darkening autumn afternoon, and understood, watching 6 farms remain safely dry through storm after storm that followed, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose he'd feared he might never find again. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving with exactly 6 hours to spare, and making every single one of them count for a whole valley that would never fully know how close it had come to losing everything to a single storm. He kept a small photograph from that night, taken by Otis's own phone in the storm's worst moments, showing the crew's exhausted, rain-soaked faces gathered around the reinforced barrier, a private reminder of exactly what a dozen strangers and a barn full of feed sacks had accomplished together when a single storm threatened to take everything. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many communities depend on aging infrastructure that nobody's properly inspected in years? One significant storm away from a failure that could have been prevented with attention nobody thought to provide until it was nearly too late. And what does it take? 6 hours, a barn full of feed sacks, a whole valley willing to show up with whatever they had. For a levee to hold through the worst storm in a decade, instead of finally giving way. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage. Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.